Good morning to the people who are watching it from India and those who are joining us from other parts of the world. Greetings from AMA. Welcome to the webinar. So we have Ms. Malti Mehta, who will be from AMA, who is a member of AMA PR committee and our course coordinator of film production program, formally introducing the speaker for the day, Ms. Julie Ciancio. And then we will have a talk and presentation from the speaker. And last 10-15 minutes, we can, if time permits, we can have the Q&A through chat box and we will answer them. Over to you, Malti ma'am.
Hello, everybody. Greetings from AMA. And it's pleasure to welcome Dr. Julie Ciancio to this morning, to this evening across the world because the different time zone we are in. I had real good opportunity to talk to her before we start this formal event or formal discussion. I would like to introduce our guest. Many of you must be knowing her personally. Maybe you must have attended some of her earlier programs, her lectures. I would like to read out very quickly, though she is just now telling about her 26 years experience in the field of academics. Dr. Julie is currently the Vice President of Academic Affairs, Chief Academic Officer, Dean of the College of Education, and Dean of International Development at Westcliff University in Irvine, California. As a Director of International Development, Dr. Julie travels around the world to establish international educational partnerships and to promote transnational education, especially for underserved regions of the globe. She was a Senior English Language Fellow through the United States Department of State under the Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs in Ahmedabad for 2 years. AMA hosted this program under its American Corner program. So Dr. Julie is aware about AMA. She was with us. And once again, we welcome her. I'm sure that she will enjoy talking about the very, very important subject today. Many of us, we tried our best to reach to global audience through this language skill. And today she will give us more insight about how important the language to reach out to the global audience. I welcome Dr. Julie, and with these few words, I would request her to start her presentation. Welcome, Dr. Julie.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you for the warm introduction. And it's always wonderful to be back at AMA, although virtually right now, but AMA has a very, very dear spot in my heart. I was stationed there, I believe it was from 2007 to 2009, so quite a few years ago already. And my time at AMA was really important for launching my career. When I was at AMA, I was responsible for teacher training, particularly for English language teacher training in the state of Gujarat, as well in Maharashtra and in Delhi, and I did some work in Tamil Nadu. And I was also teaching in the PG diploma in business at AMA. I taught pronunciation and business English and several different courses there. I even taught Portuguese language while I was there at AMA. So it was just a wonderful time in my life, and it really actually helped me to gain the skills that I needed for advancing my career. And as a result of the experience that I had at AMA, I was then able to land a position at California State University, where I became a program manager in TESOL and teaching English to speakers of other languages. And I was also responsible for international student recruitment at California State University. And I stayed there for about 10 years. And then I moved to Westcliff University, where I started as the associate dean of the College of Education, and then went to the become the dean of the College of Education, and then the dean of international development. As ma'am now mentioned, I'm currently the vice president of academic affairs, as well as the chief academic officer at Westcliff University. So you just never know where a short stay at AMA will bring you in your life and in your career. So it's really a pleasure to be back with all of you, and I can't wait until the day when I can come back and visit in person. Mr. Nair always reaches out to me and asks me when I can come back, and I would certainly love to come back as soon as things get back to normal and we can travel once again. So this evening, I'll talk about reimagining English as an additional language and implications in the online global classroom. So as I explained, my history is really in English language teaching. That was my background for many, many years. And nowadays I'm more in administration, and I'm no longer teaching classes at the university, but TESOL was a big part of my professional development. So that's, I still get called frequently to speak on this topic. But as I give this talk, I'll also make connections for those of you who are not English language teachers, but we'll talk about English in general as an additional language, and the importance of the English language for communication, and some activities that we can use in the classroom as we have all needed to do. All of our classes are now online, so it's very important to think of interesting activities that we can do now in the online classroom, but also activities that we can use later when we get back to the physical classroom. So we always want to keep our classes engaging and interactive, challenging, and exciting, no matter what the topic is. So I'll talk a bit about these three topics. I'll talk about English as an additional language, and then I'll talk about the flipped classroom model and what that is. And then we'll get into some specific activities that we can use in the classroom. So first of all, English as an additional language is, you may have heard of the terms English as a second language or English as a foreign language. Typically, we use the word English or the phrase English as a second language to refer to situations when students are learning English, but they don't have the opportunity, or they have the opportunity to use the language outside of the classroom. So like in India or in the US or Canada, if a student is studying English there, they can then go outside of the classroom and still have opportunities to use the language. They hear it on the television, they use it when they go to the grocery store or the bank or the post office. Whereas with English as a foreign language, students don't have the opportunity to use the language outside of the classroom. So if you're studying English in Korea or in Venezuela, when you go outside of the class, you don't have the opportunity to use English to speak with the bus driver or something like that. So your opportunity to practice with the language is limited to the classroom. English as an additional language is a term that's more common in used in British English, but we're starting to adopt this term more so in the United States nowadays. And the interesting thing about English as an additional language is that it really honors the students' home languages and the benefits that knowing other languages brings to the table when you're learning an additional language. So the concept of English as a second language is a misconception, thinking that the student might only have one language and then they're learning English as the second. Whereas particularly in India, this is very true, where people may speak 3 or 4 languages and learn English as well. So it's a bit presumptuous to say that English is the second language. Maybe it's the 4th or 5th language. So we don't really want to put a numerical hierarchy on the languages that a person knows. The point is that it's an additive or an additional skill. So it's another skill that the person has by learning another language. And when you know other languages previously, you're able to use your knowledge of those other languages to learn an additional language. So you already have some ideas about grammar and vocabulary and structure, and you can use those when you're acquiring an additional language. In addition, teachers who teach English as an additional language also try to honor the students' cultural background. So we want to honor people's backgrounds and what they know and what they bring to share in the classroom. For example, in the United States, we have a lot of immigrants from South America who are Spanish. And in the past, when the children would come, the families would come, and the children would go to school, and the parents would encourage the children and the teachers as well to suppress Spanish. So they wouldn't use Spanish at all. And they really wanted the children to become mainstreamed so that they would be competent and be able to be good students and eventually good professionals using the English language in their daily lives. But this was at the cost of their native language. And when you lose your native language, you also lose some of your native heritage. So then the children could no longer communicate with their grandparents because their grandparents only spoke Spanish. So there was a disconnect, and children actually lost their cultural heritage. So we've recognized that to be a mistake, that it's not so important to mainstream students and get them acclimated to US culture and language. To the contrary, we can honor their home language and their home culture and see those as a benefit to the student as a whole, because it makes them a more sensitive person, a more well-rounded person, because they have experience with other cultures and other languages. So in essence, we're recognizing diversity of languages and diversity of culture. So as we've all experienced during this pandemic, and we've needed to put all of our instruction online, what are some activities that we can use in the English language class to make it more alive? And I'm particularly talking about a synchronous class. And a synchronous class is a live class where we're engaging at the same time, as opposed to an asynchronous class where students study self-paced. So they could just log in and do some exercises and submit their exercises, and the teacher will grade them and provide feedback. But they never meet in a live Zoom session like this. And so particularly looking at a live synchronous class, how can we come up with some interesting activities? So before we get into the actual activities, I'd like to talk a little bit about what's called the flipped classroom model. And the flipped classroom model is quite interesting. If you think about the traditional teaching method, normally we have students come to class and they'll sit in a classroom, and the teacher will lecture to them, and they'll sit in isolation in their own seats, and they just passively absorb a lecture and take notes and go home. So they need to commute and come to the class and sit there, and they don't really get an opportunity to engage with their classmates. and that's the end of the class. Well, with the advent of technology, that's really an outdated way of teaching, because there's no need to go to a classroom to listen to a lecture. We can now do that from the comfort of our own homes. And we can watch video recordings, we can watch YouTube videos, and we can watch PowerPoints, and we can, there are other tools too, like VoiceThread, where you can watch lectures. And so students can inform themselves about the topic before they come to the class. So in teaching, we have generally 3 steps. The first step is to introduce the concept. The second step is for students to develop the concept. And then the third step is to master the concept. So it's introduce, develop, and master, or IDM. And in the past, we used to have students come to the classroom and the faculty member or teacher would introduce the topic in class. Well, and then maybe give them opportunity to develop and master the concept. In a flipped classroom approach, we flip that and make it contrary, or the reverse sequence occurs, in that the students introduce themselves to the topic. So they can watch the video at home, or they can read the chapter at home. They can introduce themselves to the topic. Now, of course, we're not expecting them to teach themselves, but just familiarize themselves with the topic as much as they possibly can. Then when they come to the class, they're prepared to develop and master the concept. So at this point in time, then, the teacher can give students opportunities to interact by doing group work or pair work, debates, conversations, presentations, discussions. And in this way, students can develop and master the concept. And they can bring questions, and the teacher can answer questions and highlight specific points that they may not have understood on their own. So the teaching itself is still very important. By no means are we saying that students don't need the teacher. It's just that they introduce themselves to the concept, but then they take advantage of the time in the classroom to be able to interact and engage and do more dynamic activities, which keeps it much more lively and interesting. And students tend to have better motivation and be more enthusiastic. They learn better and they retain the information much longer. You're probably all familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. Bloom's taxonomy is a pyramid of verbs that we use when we're creating objectives for a lesson. So at the bottom part of the pyramid are more basic verbs that we use. It's things like identify, list, recall, state. You know, so it's more simple activities where students can identify, you know, they can point out something on a chart, they can list topics or something like that. In the those are called lower order thinking skills at the bottom of the pyramid. When we get to the higher part of the pyramid, those are called HOTS, or higher order thinking skills. And those are those levels have different verbs in each of the levels that are much more complex, thus higher order thinking skills. So it's things like create, remember, or not remember, that's lower order, synthesize, develop, analyze. And so these verbs are verbs that are really higher order, that's more difficult for a student to be able to do. So in the traditional model, we had students doing the lower order thinking skills when they come to class, when they were getting lectured to. Whereas in the flipped classroom model, they do the lower order thinking skills at home. And then when they come to the class, they're engaging more in the higher order thinking skills. So this is why we call it the flipped classroom. It's kind of like we take the pyramid and turn it upside down. So they're doing the understand and remember at home and the apply, analyze, evaluate, and create in class. So if you were to think for a moment, if you are an English teacher, what group discussion strategies have you used to foster active learning while developing speaking skills in your synchronous online class? So take a moment to think about that and think about some fun activities that you've done. And if you're not an English teacher, you can think about activities that you would do if you're teaching a different topic. And if you're a student, you can think about how you would like content to be presented to you, to be more dynamic and interesting and to stimulate active learning where you're actively engaged in the content. So then we'll start to talk a little bit now about 3 separate activities that I wanted to kind of brainstorm and think about together. So the first one is called affinity mapping. And so it's really interesting, all of the tech tools that we have available now that we can use in the online classroom. And so we use a lot of Google, the Google suite. We use Google Docs and Google Drive and Google Sheets quite a bit at Westcliff University. And it's open source, and well, all you need is a Gmail account to be able to use it. And so with this affinity mapping, what we do is we come up with a broad question or problem that's likely to generate a lot of different ideas. And we'll open a Google Doc, and you can share the Google Doc through Zoom. And you can ask students to place stickies in the Google Doc. I'll show you in a moment an app that you can use for that. And if you don't want to use the app and the stickies, you can have students just type right on the Google Doc. So you get them to just brainstorm. And when people are brainstorming, you don't critique, you don't say that's not a good idea. You don't ask anybody to eliminate ideas or say it's a good idea or a bad idea. You just let the ideas flow. And so once all of the ideas have been generated, you might use breakout rooms and have students begin to group these ideas into similar categories. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but Zoom has a feature called breakout rooms where you can put students into separate rooms. And so this is a way of doing virtual group work. So you can put all of the students in a class into separate groups where they can have discussions and conversations amongst themselves. So like, for example, now if we've got 20, 30, 40, 50 people in this webinar, it would be difficult to have a conversation because not many people would get a turn. But if you put people into breakout rooms with, I think best practice is to have maximum 4, maybe 5 people in a group, whether you do it online or in the class. To have a conversation, because that way everybody has an opportunity to speak. So you can ask students to put these ideas into similar categories and then create a label for the category and discuss why they would want, why they gave it that label. So here's an example of how it might look. So let's say, for example, we're asking English language teachers about using, like what's a challenge for doing speaking activities in the classroom. And so these are all the different kinds of ideas that they would come up with and put these stickies. So Flippity is one of the apps that you can use to create the stickies. There's another one called Jamboard that you can use. That's also very, very nice for creating these colorful stickies and putting them on the affinity map. So then if you ask students in their breakout rooms or as a whole group to organize these into different topics, let's say perhaps they come up with these 4 topics of professional development, engagement, classroom management, and technology. So professional development would be for the teachers and how they can improve their practice and how they can become better professionals. Engagement are all of these ideas around how to keep students interacting and motivated and excited and active in their discussions about the topic. Classroom management is a topic that's difficult for people to manage in the online classroom. When people come to a webinar, they're self-selecting. They're choosing to come because they're interested. But when you have students in class who are suddenly sent to be studying from home online, sometimes they're not so excited to be there. Maybe their parents made them go to class, or they're not interested in being in high school. They'd rather be playing cricket or something, so classroom management is always an issue in the classroom, but online it becomes even more of a challenge because you can't go and stand next to that student who's not paying attention and get them to pay attention. Or you can't see if people are on their cell phones and texting while they're supposed to be paying attention. So classroom management is a big topic in the online classroom. And then finally, of course, technology and technology tools and things that you can use to make the class more interesting, like Flippity or Google Docs or Zoom even. So that was the first activity I wanted to talk about. And the second activity is called conversations. So basically what you do is you divide the students into groups and you give each group a different discussion question. So you can put the question already on the table, and you can have different tables around the room. It works really well if you have 4, maybe 6 tables. It depends on the number of students that you have and the size of the class. And then it also depends on the furniture, right? Because sometimes it's hard to walk around the class if you have a lot of benches or rows of desks where it's hard to move the furniture. But this is a really engaging activity and super fun. And these activities are very simple. They're really easy to implement, but they really produce great results. So you'll have the different topics on each table. And let's say that we use our previous topics. So those previous topics were professional development, engagement, classroom management, and technology. We could have the students themselves turn those into questions, or we as the teacher might develop the question ourselves. So if you're dealing with younger learners or more beginner students, then perhaps the teacher will develop the question. If you're dealing with adult learners or more advanced learners, you can certainly get them to develop the question. So for professional development, for example, we might ask, what are some of the professional development activities that you would like to participate in this year? And for engagement, we might say something like, what are some activities that you use to foster engagement in your classroom? Or what are some of the challenges for fostering engagement in your classroom, for example? So then you have the students in groups at the different tables, and then you have the students talk for a set amount of time, usually 3 minutes or 5 minutes max, depending on how engaged they are, and you can monitor it. So once you see the conversation start to die down, then you can call time for the group to switch. And what you do is you have one person remain at their table. So let's say you have groups of 4 at each table. So you would have 3 people go to the next table and 1 person stays. So the 3 are going to move around clockwise, but there's 1 person who remains at each table. That person who stays is responsible for summarizing the conversation that the previous group had. So remember, to summarize is a more higher order thinking skill. It's difficult to summarize. You have to be able to synthesize ideas. You have to remember the key points. You have to take notes. So you have to listen, you have to write, you have to be able to speak. So it's a challenging activity for the person to capture all the ideas and be able to summarize what their group talked about. And then after the person has summarized, then they'll carry on the conversation from where it left off previously. So you want the conversation to go even deeper and talk about new ideas and new topics. This can be done verbally. Students can talk about it. Of course, they could write about it. You could ask them to just take notes, just do bullet points, or you could have them write a paragraph and leave the paragraph on the table. And then when the 3 students go to the next table, they've already got that paragraph there that the one student who remains behind to summarize can use as their notes when they're explaining to the new people. So each time you switch the groups, a different person will stay behind. And the interesting thing about this too is then the groups keep changing. So that keeps the dynamic. So that keeps the dynamic evolving. So you don't have the same 4 people talking to each other about each topic. Not that that's a bad thing, but this just adds more complexity to it. And so then students, like when you have the paragraph, if you do it written, you can use some different techniques for students to, for example, underline new words that they don't know, or to check ideas that they had already thought of. And they might put an exclamation point or a star or something like that next to the ideas that they thought were really important or interesting. So you can teach them note-taking techniques to use as well. So these were some examples of the questions. So you could use these 3 activities in a sequence. So you could do the affinity mapping first and get students to generate ideas around a topic. The topic, it might be generated by the textbook or by current events or something that you need to cover anyway. And then they'll categorize those ideas that they brainstormed, they put them into categories, and then they create questions around them. So like for the category of tech tools, we might say, how can I use different tech tools for online teaching? And for classroom management, we might say, how can I transfer my classroom management skills to the online environment? And as I mentioned before, that's been a huge challenge for teachers, because some teachers who are great in the classroom might have difficulty online. They might feel a disconnect. They might really love to be next to their students and love to be able to look them in the eye and come up next to them and chat with them personally. So sometimes transitioning to the online environment can be quite a challenge. If the teacher doesn't have very good technology skills, or even if the technology is not available, maybe the internet connection is not good, or they don't have a computer, so that can be another challenge with online. So the last activity that I'd like to talk about is called instructional conversations. And this is one of my favorite activities. It's really interesting, and it promotes some great conversation. It sounds real simple, but it works really, really well. It's super interesting. So first of all, what you need to do is you need to have a prompt. So the prompt is something that students use to chat. You're going to create like a small paragraph, and I'll give you an example of a prompt in a moment and show you how it works. But it's a little scenario or vignette. It's a situation that is going to provoke conversation. And there's some parameters around the prompt, and for the prompt to work well, it has to be developed around these parameters. I'll explain those in a moment. And you put students in a circle, and sometimes we call this circle a fishbowl, because you have about 7 students, about 5 to 7 students that will sit in a circle in the classroom. And then you'll have the rest of the group around the fishbowl. So they'll be observing the students in the center who are having the conversation. So the students on the outside are not participating, they're just observing. Only those 7 in the center are actually participating in the activity at this time. And so there's usually a leader of the group or a moderator, and the moderator is responsible for stimulating, encouraging the conversation. However, they're really not supposed to ask questions. There's several things that students learn by participating in these instructional conversations. So there's some ground rules. And one of the ground rules is that everybody should take a turn, and that people should be allowed to have a turn. I'm sure you've all noticed that frequently there's somebody who kind of will dominate the conversation if you put students into group. There's usually one student who's very active and very talkative and not at all shy, and they're not afraid to speak. And then you have other students who are usually more quiet, more reserved, more shy. Maybe they don't feel as confident about their English or about the topic. So they're just happy to sit back and be quiet and not participate. But in this instructional conversation, they know that each person has an obligation to at least say one thing. So the moderator is really going to pay attention to the body language of the people around the room and try to pull out those students who are kind of quiet by just looking at them and leaning forward and showing that they're interested in what that person has to say. Of course, we want to hear from those talkative people too, and they'll probably get the conversation going, but they also know that they need to give the others a chance. And one of the things that we can do is to teach students strategies to get their turn. And this is a great strategy just for conversation in general. If you have somebody like that in your life, or somebody that you know who's super talkative and doesn't let you in, you have to use some strategies to be able to get your turn. They're really good at holding the floor, so they'll talk without stopping. They'll talk without looking at you. They might look down or something, because if they get eye contact with you and they see that you want to participate, if they're being polite, they should allow you to participate. It doesn't mean that just because you make eye contact, they will let you. But the moderator should encourage the others to use these turn-taking strategies to be able to get a turn. So some of those turn-taking strategies are using connectors and saying like, you have a good point, but, oh, I'd like to disagree. Well, I'm not so sure about that. So you have to kind of jump in and provide a bridge to what it is that you want to say. You can provide roles to each of the people in this out in the outside of the circle, so that they have something to do, because this is a big problem with like, for example, presentations in class. If you have a couple of students present, the other students may not listen because they know that they don't have to. Frequently, they're more concerned about their own upcoming presentation, so they don't really pay attention to what the other students have to say when they're presenting. So it's really nice to give everybody a role or a task that they need to perform while they're listening. So this is a great strategy for presentations as well as the instructional conversations. One person can be a note taker and take notes of what everybody is saying so that they can kind of summarize the different main points that came up during the conversation. Another person can be the time taker and count the time that each person speaks, because remember, one of the goals is to let everybody speak. So after the conversation is over, then we'll analyze that and say, oh, this person took 10 minutes, whereas the other person only got 30 seconds, which happens sometimes. So we want to kind of analyze that. There's another person might keep track of vocabulary, and that might be vocabulary that was generated during the affinity map or during the conversations activity. So those, when they wrote the paragraph and they underlined key vocabulary, then we could ask the people in the fishbowl, in the instructional conversation, to make an effort to use this new vocabulary. So there will be a vocabulary tracker in the outside circle who will keep track of the new vocabulary being used. You can give another person the role of counting the fillers. Fillers are things like like things like that. Those are words that people who tend to be very talkative, or not necessarily, but who's ever speaking, it's a technique that people can use to hold the floor. And so that means that they don't want to give up their turn. So you can keep your turn by using fillers, because it doesn't give the other person the opportunity to jump in and start a new turn. Fillers are also, it's considered a bad habit or a vice in language that people also use when they're searching for vocabulary in their own mind. So perhaps their ideas aren't clear to themselves, they're not sure what they want to express. So they'll use fillers to hold their turn while they're organizing their thoughts or searching for vocabulary. Another student might look for non-linguistic representations. That would be body language. So maybe they're looking for facial gestures or hand gestures or posture, if people have their arms closed or their legs crossed, or if they look somewhat aggressive, if they sit forward. So people might take note of that, and we can discuss the nonverbal or non-linguistic representations after the conversation when we do the debrief, when the conversation is over. And another person can count the turns. So the number of times the number of times that people speak, not the duration, but just the frequency or the number. So after you have the conversation, you'll have the prompt first. You'll assign the roles first, and then you'll read the prompt. You'll have the prompt first, but in sequence. The moderator is the person responsible for reading the prompt. And then the people inside the fishbowl will have the conversation. You don't set a predetermined time limit. You just let the conversation go naturally. When it starts to die down, then you can call it over. If you set a time limit, then it's artificial, and people know that, like, oh, the time's almost up, I better get my turn in. So then they'll really be aggressive to jump in. You want it to be a bit more natural. So it's not a good idea to set a time limit up front. So here's an example of a prompt. Let's say Verma Patel has a class of 40 students. Because of coronavirus, students are learning online. Verma Patel is not competent, as she has never taught virtually before. She is accustomed to students paying attention to lessons and usually earning good grades. Students are finding online learning difficult and are failing. What does she do? Fail her students? So the moderator can read the prompt. They might ask if there are any questions, if everybody understood all the words. So they might say something like, does everybody know virtually? Do you know what that means? Everybody, of course, knows what coronavirus means nowadays, right? So if there's any challenging vocabulary, they can discuss that. The prompt, I said it was very important in that the prompt to be constructed a specific way. The prompt really needs to be appropriate for the age group and the background of the students. It has to be relatable. So like if you're talking to a group of college students, you want to talk about something that is pertinent to them, to something that's going on in college life. Whereas if you're talking to a group of elementary students, it would be a totally different topic. Or if you're talking to a group of adults, and it depends on their background. Are we talking to adults who are studying business, or adults who are studying English, or another topic? So the prompt has to be very specific for that group, or else it won't generate a good conversation. So in this situation, there's always a dilemma too in the prompt. So here's the dilemma. She's a good teacher, but she's having trouble with online. She's never done it before, and her students are usually really good, but now they're not doing well. And, you know, you have to hold the students accountable. The semester's almost over. What are you going to do? Are you going to fail them? But I think that maybe she feels a little bit of responsibility for this because maybe she's not so good at teaching online. So is it fair for her to fail the students? This is a difficult time. Maybe they have family members who are ill. Maybe they're afraid. Maybe they're tired of being isolated. You know, there could be other issues that are going on. So this would all be part of the conversation that we would have in the small group. So then after you have that conversation in the small group, then you would let the conversation die down naturally. And then you could let each person around the circle who had a different task report on their task in terms of summarizing number of turns taken, the duration of some of the turns, the fillers, the vocabulary. So it's a really, really rich conversation. So you can see if you, each one of these 3 activities in isolation are very nice activities. You don't have to do all 3 of them together, but they lead into each other very nicely. So if you start with the first one with the brainstorming activity, with doing, categorizing the ideas, and then you do the conversations based on those same ideas to get students thinking about it. And then you can have a prompt that has something to do with those topics that you have been discussing. The more time that students have to prepare before they actually speak, the better their speaking will be. So if they've had time to think about their ideas, to learn some vocabulary in relation to the topic, the whole conversation will be much more productive. If you just ask students this question right off the bat, and you were to say to your whole group, well, here's this scenario, what do you think? You're not going to get nearly the same type of engagement and interactivity as you would if you give students time to kind of warm up to this activity. So at the end here, let's open it up for the last few minutes. We've got about 10, 15 minutes for Q&A. Do you have some questions? And maybe think about this. What's one thing you learned during the session, one thing that you liked? And how can you incorporate it into your English language class if you're an English language teacher? Or how can you incorporate it into your class if you're a teacher of another topic? Or what are some of these activities that you would like to see teachers use in the classroom when you're a student?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Julie. I hope the session, everyone enjoyed the session. There were many people who are viewing it on YouTube also. So participants, please post your questions in the chat box. Yeah, you may please post your questions in the chat box. You may also, if you want, you can unmute yourself and ask it.
Hello.
Yeah, please, Manish, go ahead.
Okay. Dr. Julie, good morning. This is Manish from VPMP Polytechnic, Gandhinagar. I hope you remember my institute.
I do. How are you?
I'm fine. How about you?
I'm fine. So lovely to hear from you.
Yeah, same here. Now, Julie, I would appreciate it if you could elaborate on how we can motivate students for, you know, online sessions. See, attending a session while being online is another thing, and being attentive is altogether a different thing. So, because you know, you are acquainted with the educational setup here in India and especially in Gujarat. Can you throw some more light on, in the context of the students in Gujarat, how we can motivate them to be as attentive as they have been in offline classes?
Have you been having difficulty with them being attentive in class?
Yeah, when they are online, sometimes we find that they are physically present, they register the attendance, but then they don't seem to participate in Q&A and in other discussions. So that is the
Right.
issue.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I think that one of the most important things are the types of questions that you ask students. I see a lot of teachers doing or asking open-ended questions, just things like, oh, okay, does everybody understand? Are there any questions? And nobody speaks up, right? Those questions fall flat. So it has to be more specific questions, and it can be directed to specific students to pull them out. But I would ask them questions about the content, specifically whatever it is that you covered, and real specific questions. But it can't be just open-ended. Did everybody understand that? That just doesn't work. When you have different activities, like let's say, for example, you're going to show a video clip in your class. Before you show a video clip, you should have maybe 2 or 3 questions of things that students need to look for in the video clip. And so you present the questions, you show the short video clip, and then they have to answer those questions. But remember, you always have to give them a reason for listening, because if you just put on a video and then ask them like, oh, what did you think of the video? Or, can somebody say something about the video? It's too open-ended, and sometimes they maybe even want to participate, but they don't know exactly what to say. It's really up to us to formulate good questions in order to get good responses out of students. So that's one technique, is to create questions around videos. Videos are a good way to get students engaged. You need to be very careful with the videos that you choose. You have to be sure that they're up to date, that they're current, and that they're interesting for your target audience, and that also that they're short. I recommend using videos no longer than 3 minutes. And I see a lot of teachers using videos much longer than that, and students start to not pay attention. So if you remember when we talked about the flipped classroom, why would they come to class to watch a YouTube video when they can easily do that at home? So it has to be very specifically chosen for the classroom content. So they see that you're spending time to prepare the lesson. It's not that you're using the video to babysit in class just to keep them busy and fill the time. So I think that that's really the main thing, is asking good questions. You can embed questions, like if you're using a PowerPoint for a lecture, I always embed questions, like every 2-3 slides, I'll have questions. So like, for example, this one I did kind of as a webinar, just like where I spoke for the 40 minutes, and then we opened it up for Q&A. But if I were teaching this like in a regular classroom, I would have stopped at each of the activities to discuss those activities with students. So it's good to build in those opportunities along the way for conversation, also for discussion. And then the other important point too is classroom management. We talked a little bit about classroom management skills and how that's a bit more challenging in the online environment. But when I observe teachers who have a really good classroom management practice, even in the online space, all of their students participate. I think it has a lot to do with the teacher's expectations. So they're just very serious, and their expectation is that everybody will participate, just like the expectation in that activity, the instructional conversation. You set the ground rules at the beginning. The expectation is that everybody will participate. I don't know what your policy is there, but at our university at Westcliff, we have the obligation that all the students and the faculty member have their cameras on so that the faculty member can see the students' faces. Sometimes they have the camera on, but it's pointing at the ceiling or something, so that's not allowed. Their face needs to be seen, they need to be in the camera. So if you have these expectations, like, look, you're paying attention, you're online, I can see your face, and you need to participate. That really helps a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Julie.
Thank you.
We have one more question in the chat box. Shall I read it out or?
Yes, can you please?
Yeah. Now there is a lot of emphasis on learning Indian languages nowadays.
Nice.
Thanks to India's new education policy, which was recently announced by our Prime Minister. So does this pose a threat to learning English as a global language? Like right now, it is a 3-language policy as per NEP. That is, of those 3, at least 2 should be Indian languages.
Awesome. I'm so happy to hear that. Actually.
Yeah, so it's good to learn Indian languages, but we cannot imagine working or communicating online without English. So there's hardly any tech support for Indian languages. So what's your views, ma'am?
Yeah, well, you know, when I was talking at the very beginning about English as an additional language, and English as an additional language, we are honoring the students' home language and their home culture. And as you all know, language and culture are very much intertwined. You can't separate one from the other. And I think personally that it's a great tragedy. There are thousands of languages that die every year. Language death is a serious issue. And that is due to the rampant increase of English. Of course, there are huge benefits to everybody speaking a common language, and we can understand each other and make friends across the world. And it's easy to get around, and you know, it's easy in an emergency, and you know, it facilitates all of our lives. And it's become the predominant language for business and medicine and so many in technology and so many fields that I think that there's no risk whatsoever of English losing its foothold, except for perhaps to Chinese. I mean, the language and power are also closely intertwined. So in the past, French used to be the world language, and it's directly related to military power. And as military power and prestige of a country subside, so does the world dominance and presence of their language. Nowadays, French is not a world language. It's not spoken vastly around the world. Portuguese was a language like that for a while, and so was Spanish, not to the extent of French or English. But so I say that because someday, who knows, if Chinese becomes the world dominant power, we may all need to learn Chinese. I think that English has a very strong foothold as being the dominant language around the world because of its simplicity. I mean, it really is easy to learn in terms of the number of verb tenses that we have. So like, for example, in some of the Romance languages, like in Spanish, there are 23 different verb tenses. Whereas in English, I'm not sure exactly how many there are off the top of my head, but I would guess like 8. You know, so there's a huge difference in complexity with the grammar in English. And so that's one of the other reasons that makes it so dominant. So I understand what you're saying in that the students definitely need to learn English because that's the language that they need for professional life upon graduation. And they're not going to be able to get a very high position speaking a local village language because they're not going to be able to communicate with people outside of that language group. But if we don't preserve these languages, they will die and the culture will die along with them. So I am totally in favor of efforts to protect native languages, and it's part of humanity that could be lost forever. When these languages die, that language is gone forever, and so is that culture. So we need to balance it. As with everything in life, a good, healthy balance is important. So this sounds like the policy has a nice balance. Like, you need to learn English as well as your native language, and probably a couple others too, right?
Now, Julie ma'am, you can hear me?
Yes, I can. Hello, Mr.
Yes.
Nair. How are you?
Good morning. And it is indeed a great help and very nice. You know that after you were coming to AMA, we started so many programs. There are 4 programs happening in the English language at the moment. And you'll
Right.
be happy to know Inductor Thumb is a furnace manufacturer based in USA, has sponsored the Institute of English at AMA.
Wow,
We have
fantastic.
Inductor Thumb, AMA, Institute of English Language.
Wow,
You
wonderful.
have to come again and organize a big conference in Ahmedabad.
Fabulous. Let's do it.
Kindly come, and thank you very much for giving this talk to AMA. And we all got a lot of ideas from your talk, and it is really indeed a great thing. And we have published 2 books about your books. Oh,
Oh,
in
yes,
the
yes.
next conference, we will publish another book of you.
Fabulous, fabulous. Thank you so
When you are
much.
visiting India, kindly come and stay in our guest house here.
Oh, my pleasure. I would love
And
to.
help us in this Inductor Thumb AMA Institute of English Language.
Lovely, lovely. Let's do
Great.
it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Thank you all the participants. Very nice on Saturday morning attending this conference. Thank you very much, Julie ma'am.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh,
It's such
there
a
midnight.
pleasure.
You are midnight. Thank you.
Thank you,
day.
everybody. Thank you.
Great day. Thank you very much.
Thank
Good
you.
night.
Thank you, ma'am. With your permission, I'll end the
End the
meeting.
meeting.
Sure. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.